Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm joined by my colleagues Brian Carey, Janice Hogan, Erkong I, Blake Wilson, and Eric Schulwolf. I'm Randy Pravila, and we're here to share with you our views on the recent ACLA versus FDA and AMP versus FDA summary judgment decision of March 31st, 2025. Thank you very much. Look forward to having this helpful discussion. Brian, to you.
Thank you, Randy. And over the past 2 decades, we've really seen enormous advances in clinical genomics driven by next generation sequencing and other technologies that have led to improved diagnostics for genetic conditions, cancer, and other life-threatening diseases. But at the same time, the industry and providers have faced enormous regulatory uncertainty about what the framework is at the federal and state level with FDA and CLIA regulation. And this uncertainty has really impacted the commercial development and reimbursement of many new tests over the last 10 years.
Almost 20 years, that same 20 years that Brian talked about, the FDA, courts, Congress have all been faced over time with the question of should FDA be permitted to regulate LDTs? And for all these years, we've been following closely, and finally we have an answer. And now that we do have a definitive answer, we believe this will have profound effects on both the lab industry and IVD companies. And so one of our goals today is to try and answer some of the questions that we are getting from our clients across those sectors.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Brian. If we could move on now, Erkong and Eric, would you please discuss briefly the history of the IVD regulation under both CLIA and the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act?
Sure. I will start from the FDA side. The Medical Device Amendment of 1976 granted FDA jurisdiction over medical devices, including in vitro diagnostics. For many years, FDA has exercised enforcement discretion regarding LDTs, meaning that while FDA claims it has authority to regulate these LDT tests, it generally chose not to enforce certain regulatory requirements. Over the years, there have been multiple efforts, both from FDA and from legislature, to bring LDTs under the same regulatory framework as other IVDs. These included the 2014 draft guidance by FDA, which was later withdrawn, and bills of the VALID Act introduced to multiple congressional sessions, which did not garner enough support to be enacted. The most recent move by FDA was this final rule published by FDA in 2024, which is the subject of the court case and will be discussed in more detail in our webinar today. But before we go there, I'll let Eric to talk about the current regulation of clinical laboratory under CLIA.
So as Randy and Erkong pointed out, and as the court noted in its decision, there's a complex and detailed regulatory framework that's separately been established under the aegis of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, governing the clinical laboratories that develop and perform LDTs. And this is under the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments of 1988, as well as the detailed regulations at 42 CFR Part 493. These regulations broadly take place at the laboratory level with specific requirements based on the category and the complexity of testing. The major way the regulations operate is through the granting and renewal of CLIA certification. And the big ones here are the Certificate of Compliance based on review by a state agency or CMS reviewers, and then certificates of accreditation, which are another option based on approval and certification by accreditation organizations approved by CMS, of which a major one is CAP. There's also sprung up a wide variety of different state regulations and licensure requirements for both clinical laboratories and LDTs. And while many states simply rely on CLIA, a large number of other states have their own lab licensure requirements. And I think it's important briefly to touch on the most prominent of these, which is the state of New York. And New York State's important because their clinical laboratory evaluation program through the Wadsworth Center both extensively regulates labs and then also crucially requires approval by CLEP of any LDTs that are performed on specimens taken from the state of New York. And that's critical because New York is obviously a very large market, and so they have a lot of power to regulate and approve LDTs at the test level rather than just at the lab level.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Janice. I think it's important to note here that we all understand that from a patient healthcare perspective, we're talking about whether something is a test that is marketed, a physical object that is marketed by one group of people who make them to allow doctors to get patient-specific information versus a laboratory-developed service that is offered by that laboratory that also takes that same patient sample, analyzes in very similar ways to generate the same type of patient result. So you can see why there would be this conflict and this interest between the two various regulatory bodies as to how those products might be viewed. And the long history that we've just gone through of the regulations, the statutes that's summarized very well in the court cases summary judgment focuses on who's making what as opposed to how a patient is getting useful information. And that led FDA to issue its final rule that was mentioned earlier. Blake, would you like to walk us through the history of the final rule and what it would have done?
Oh, absolutely. And appreciate Erkang and Eric for giving us that history there. And obviously, this was the culmination of multiple attempts for FDA to try and come in and more actively regulate this space. And essentially coming off the failure to pass the Ballot Act at the end of 2022 with the omnibus bill, FDA then takes initiative to propose a new rule that would regulate laboratory developed tests as medical devices and impose a very similar framework. That rule was proposed in October of 2023. And then in very quick fashion, following the comment period, a final rule was actually published in May of 2024. So very short period from October of 2023 for the proposed rule to the final rule being published in May of 2024. And essentially what FDA's proposal was, again, to regulate medical LDTs as medical devices. And they would utilize a phase-in approach in recognition that they had been exercising enforcement discretion in this area. And that phase-in approach would take place over 4 years, where in 2025, they would start having LDTs required to have MDR reporting. In 2026, there would be registration and listing requirements. 2027, there would be implementation of the quality system regulations under Part 820. And then finally, at the end of 2027 and the beginning of 2028, we would see pre-market clearance and approval requirements for laboratory developed tests. There were carve-outs certainly within the final rule for different types of tests approved at the state level, specifically in New York. But largely, this would be a huge transition of laboratory developed tests into the traditional FDA risk-based framework that would eventually require pre-market clearance or approval, with limited exceptions, I would say, for grandfathering and the types of changes that you can make to tests that were already on the market at the time the final rule was published in May of 2024. And this, of course, leads into a lawsuit almost immediately after the publication of the final rule with the ACLA, or American Clinical Laboratories Association, suing the FDA in, I believe it was the end of May, around May 24th of 2024, to prevent the FDA from actually implementing this final rule. And so that was filed in the Eastern District of Texas. And that lawsuit, I believe went through pretty quickly with, as Randy just indicated, summary judgment in favor of the plaintiffs, being issued just the other week on March 31st, 2025. And Brian, just want to turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about the litigation of the ACLA case.
Yeah, Brian, very quickly before you start, I understand that this tension between laboratories and medical device manufacturers exists predominantly because, as Eric and Erkang already laid out, there's a complex regulatory structure that affects each of those individuals. And to be operating as a clinical laboratory, but also be a medical device manufacturer, creates a lot of those hurdles. So, Brian, again to you, if you could go through some of the more of a discussion about the history of the lawsuit and how this came about.
Sure. And as Blake noted, I think the rule finalized by the FDA was viewed as such a significant departure from the agency's history in the regulation of the laboratory industry that you saw the two primary stakeholders in the area, the American Clinical Laboratory Association on behalf of the labs and the Association for Molecular Pathology, bringing separate lawsuits. The first one being brought by ACLA in the Eastern District of Texas. Then later in the summer, in August of 24, AMP filed a separate suit in the Southern District of Texas, and those two were consolidated because they raised really the identical issues that we're going to focus on today of did Congress give FDA the authority under the Food, Drug, and Medical Device Act to regulate laboratory tests, or was the authority given to CMS through CLIA and to the states? And so both of the litigations really raised questions under the Administrative Procedures Act of whether FDA had gone beyond the stated legislative authority given to them by Congress, and in doing so had acted arbitrary and capricious by establishing this completely new framework that would impose significant burdens and costs and raise new uncertainties about whether the agency even had the resources to be able to review all these new tests that would be coming under its authority. And we had oral arguments in February, and then the decision in March, which we'll go through. And I'll turn it back to Janice and Randy to go through the court's decision.
Thank you, Brian. Janice, would you like to discuss a little bit about how the court decided in this particular summary judgment?
Sure. So the court in a summary judgment has a high standard to face to decide basically that there's not enough merit for things to go forward to a full trial. And that's what the court decided here. And the main crux of the decision was that the services provided by laboratories do not meet the definition of a device under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And by reaching the decision in that way, the court was very definitive and said essentially that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was designed for FDA to regulate things, physical things that move in interstate commerce, and that even though there is language, there's an enumerated definition of a device, it's instrument, apparatus, contrivance, and there are words there that FDA tried to argue would cover a lab testing service. The court definitely did not agree and had some very strong language about this. Essentially, the court said that the term IVD test system and the definition that FDA tried to put forward was inconsistent with the whole history of development of the FTC Act and CLIA, and that FDA had created its own terminology to try to collapse that distinction. They differentiated, for example, between a discrete set of tangible test articles packaged for commercial distribution, like a COVID-19 test kit, versus tools that laboratories use to deliver a service. And the court said FDA could not put those two things together, and that a device versus a service are different things. but it leaves open the question beyond just tests that are developed and validated in a single lab. That is what the court ruled on. Can tests that are developed and validated in a single lab be considered devices? And to that, they said a definitive no.
Thank you, Janice. Brian and Eric, could you also talk about some of the potential other concerns that the court used in reaching this decision, some of the other issues they tried to balance in their approach for this analysis?
Sure. I think one thing that the stakeholders did in a lot of the briefing and the amicus filings was just talk about the extent of the laboratory developed tests that exist in the United States, which was really astonishing, the number of tests and labs that are developing, tests in all disease areas. And they looked at, really what would be the capacity of the FDA to take something on like this, what would be the resources of the agency, and what would be the burdens on the industry of having to comply with two separate regulatory regimes. And in some cases, they would be conflicting regimes. And one of the pieces of information I think that was really powerful that was submitted in the court cases was just looking at the experience during the COVID pandemic, where diagnostics played a key role in the nation's response to the pandemic. And that was only a sliver of the LDT market. And we saw backlogs at the agency, and staff had to be diverted from other parts of CDRH. And so there was a real question about, both the legal authority, but what would be the practical, feasible effect on the industry to try to come into compliance with these regulations.
Thank you. Eric, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just quickly, another point that the court found implausible is what the court termed to be FDA's position that Congress had quietly approved in the 1970s or quietly intended under its enactment in the 1970s to essentially outlaw what has developed as the primary methodology of performing laboratory services in the United States, that is, LDTs. And the court sort of took they raised this position, and then essentially they had raised it to shut it down and say, no, this is an implausible reading.
Excellent. Thank you. And that issue about statutory interpretation is going to come up as we continue to move forward in looking at the impact of this court case on existing processes and compliance requirements, both for laboratories and in vitro diagnostic manufacturers. Under the recent Supreme Court case, the Loper-Bright and its companion case, that led to the reinterpretation of the Chevron doctrine. This question of statutory interpretation does arise here, but I think it arises mostly in the context of how the CLIA and CMS and FDA, as they move forward, interpret their authority under this decision. Clearly, if there's opportunity here for FDA to reinvigorate its enforcement with respect to the components and parts that are used to make the in vitro the laboratory developed tests, if they don't have authority over the LDTs per se, there are LDTs, as we're going to talk about briefly in a moment, that are also already regulated by FDA in various contexts. And we expect there to be the potential for the reassessment and litigation of FDA's decision-making and its reasonableness, given the breadth of the Loper-Bright decision and their ability for litigants to argue that FDA has overstepped or CMS has overstepped its bounds in interpretation of those statutes. Before we get there, however, I would like to look at, what are the next steps? What could be happening? What could FDA do in this particular case? How willing is it able to seek appeal under the current administration? How FDA may choose to regulate this space generally, and the impact on the laboratories themselves, as well as potential legislation. So moving forward in that vein, Janice, would you like to touch on the next steps and where we are with respect to what may happen from here?
Sure. So the final rule was vacated and remanded to FDA for further consideration based on the opinion. But I would say that the court gave FDA the strongest direction not to backslide. The court said, and this is a quote, there is no likelihood that FDA can justify its decision on remand, given that the final rule exceeds its authority under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So by saying that, I think the court is cautioning FDA. As many may remember, the FDA has not always acted in a manner that completely complied, one might say, with the orders of other federal courts. Decisions like Prevor come to mind. There, however, the case was sent back to FDA to reconsider. Here, the court was clear. They don't expect that FDA will be able to ease out of this on remand. So now FDA will need to consider what to do to try to modify the rule, renew efforts at legislation, act essentially in defiance of the court's direction, which I think is unlikely under the current administration. And of course, the government could decide to appeal the decision, but given the strong wording, the current political environment, and what we know of the Trump administration's views on this, that looks uncertain to unlikely, I would say, at best. Under the first Trump administration, the Office of Counsel gave a legal opinion, which is publicly available, that basically expressed a view that FDA did not have the authority to regulate lab-developed tests. And so if that holds, one would think that an appeal is not so likely, but we'll know in the next couple of months.
Great. Thank you, Janice. I do think, however, it's important to note that the court, this summary judgment and the court that issued it was very specific about what it viewed a laboratory developed test to be. And they focused on a number of criteria, including developed within a single laboratory and offered within that laboratory's direction. And I think that there may be opportunities here that FDA may consider how to regulate this space by focusing on one of two extremes. One is, are there component parts that are being used in this laboratory developed test? Is it being offered in multiple laboratories? Is it being shared across laboratories with know-how? Are there common software that is being used across multiple areas to analyze these results? And I think it's possible that the agency may wish to distinguish the very specific holding from this case that LDTs are offered, developed, and provided as a service to in a single laboratory to ordering physicians, and whether they're promoted for home use or whether they're promoted direct to consumer or whether they are across multiple laboratories or the information is shared. I think that the agency FDA could in many ways seek to regulate those types of services that exceed the bounds that are outlined in this particular case. We also think it's highly likely that FDA will focus on regulation of the individual component parts, how the sample collection devices are developed and offered, and how they can be provided to patients and where the samples are being taken, where those component parts, whether they're analyte-specific reagents, which is a category of materials that FDA does regulate, they're tangible articles that are provided to a laboratory and the laboratory can use in the development of an LDT. FDA can focus also its enforcement on and its regulation over those types of tangible articles that they have. So I think there's yet to be seen how FDA may regulate in this particular space. And whether they do or they don't, I'd like to explore with a little bit of, again, with Brian and Eric, what is the impact likely to be on the laboratories, both high complexity laboratories that have historically been involved with LDTs, and whether this also may impact any moderate or waived lab locations, and what's the liability of those particular kinds of issues. So Brian and Eric, to you.
Thank you, Randy. And I think one of the issues that has come up over the past 2 decades is with this regulatory uncertainty, there's been a real question on, how is that going to impact the reimbursement and commercialization of LDTs? And what we've seen over the past 2 decades is because of the enforcement discretion, most of the LDTs on the market are not regulated by the FDA and have not gone through the device approval pathway. And as a result, the reimbursement framework has grown up around the LDT. And as Eric was saying, this is another part of the court's decision that really, it sort of was implausible that you could have a whole system that was based on LDTs, but then you couldn't really be an LDT because the FDA had authority over them. That's how the reimbursement market has really worked out. So if you look at the FDA's sister agency, CMS, which has authority over the CLIA program, the reimbursement system has largely been built around an LDT approach and has not taken a distinction between FDA versus LDT pathway. And I think the most evident part of this is that Medicare has created a specific program called the MolDX program, the Molecular Diagnostic Program, that really reviews the vast majority of LDTs in the country, and their framework doesn't take into account FDA status at all. They do their own assessment of analytical validity and clinical validity as submitted by the laboratory, and then their primary focus is on clinical utility, which they've been very clear over the years that the FDA does not address utility. And so they haven't really taken a view of whether something is FDA cleared or approved or not. I think that pathway, will continue and won't really be impacted by the court's ruling. But in certain specific areas, we have seen CMS more at a national level use FDA approval as some type of external validation for when the agency wants to make a coverage decision conditioned on a certain type of test, a certain subpopulation of patients. They have looked to FDA, and so there will be an issue where we'll look to see how the CMS addresses that. The most notable areas really have been in the colorectal cancer screening tests, where CMS has a national coverage determination that does include differentiation based on whether a test is FDA authorized. And also in the next generation sequencing for advanced cancer, there are different pathways. There's a pathway at the national level for FDA approved tests and through the Medicare contractor level for lab developed tests. And we've also seen it play out in payment distinctions with advanced diagnostic laboratory tests. So there's a separate pathway for tests that are FDA cleared or approved, but those are really the exception and not the rule. And we'll have to see, going forward, how CMS will address those situations. Eric, are there other points you could add where you see this distinction coming up?
Yeah, so I think you covered a lot of them. A couple that I might add, although I think that at the end of the day they may be less impactful than first meets the eye, is there is a set of laws that have been passed in about half the states called biomarker coverage laws, which broadly obligate commercial payers, and in many cases the Medicaid program, to make payment for biomarker testing that satisfies one or more of an enumerated set of categories of evidence. One of those categories of evidence that's listed in most of the biomarker laws is FDA approval or clearance. And so to the extent that that pathway ceases to be available to LDTs, there could be some knock-on effects there. The other area is, to what extent, as if FDA indeed leaves the field broadly in terms of regulation of laboratory developed tests, to what extent will that impact, will that cause additional states to jump in? And, again, there's 50 jurisdictions that need to be considered here. So there's always a danger about making blanket statements about states and what they're going to do. But, I think, especially if we're in a time of tighter budgets, I think that there's a decent chance that a lot of other states will continue to do what I think largely they have done, which is essentially rely on the state of New York to do a lot of the individual review of laboratory developed tests that, using the important market power of that state. So I think those are sort of two related points, but broadly, as Brian indicated, the insofar as we live in an LDT dominated laboratory reimbursement world, a lot of that is sort of going to continue. And that's probably the main takeaway. And then there are these certain discrete areas where CMS National in particular relies on FDA as sort of a differentiator for coverage purposes. And that's an area where, there could be a bit more murkiness depending on what the FDA does.
Great. Thank you both. Blake, I'd like to explore very briefly with you what are the potential for additional legislation? And then in the brief time that we have left, I also would like to focus a little bit on some of the actions that we expect to be labs and various stakeholders in this space may take, and some of the questions that our clients have been asking and concerns that they have. So Blake, for you on legislation, and then an open discussion between us about what we expect to see coming in the future.
Sure. And I think, potential legislation could be a pretty brief discussion. In reality, there was really only one framework put forward in a bill that was a viable approach to regulating LDTs, which was the Ballot Act, which Congress, has been put into Congress in a couple of different forms, and they failed to pass into law at the end again of 2022. There is some questions, I guess, around could there be some appetite later on in the year? There was some leftover life sciences and healthcare matters that hadn't been addressed by Congress previously that, could have some momentum here. But, I think that there's a question of what is Congress's appetite really to step into this space now with this court ruling. And I'm not sure that the juice is going to be there to push anything through with any meaningful vigor.
Great, thank you. Now, in the context of the various stakeholders here, laboratories, in vitro diagnostics manufacturers, the ancillary equipment and the analyzer manufacturers, parts of the systems that are used in traditional in vitro diagnostic tests. As a round robin, what do we expect some of those tensions to be? I mean, we have laboratories that have sought and obtained FDA authorization. As Brian mentioned, there's greater reimbursement with laboratory developed tests that are offered as companion diagnostics. There are products that are being used as part of clinical studies. There are services that are being offered as part of clinical studies as LDTs. What are some of the things that we think are likely to be the tensions and options that stakeholders in this space may want to consider? Round robin, anybody can please join in.
I think one question we're already getting from clients who have already approved tests or are in the process of seeking FDA approval is, should I stop? Should I delist my product if I believe it meets the definition of an LDT? There may be companies that choose to do that. If they do, they'd have to be confident it won't negatively affect them on the reimbursement side. Other companies may decide they still want the FDA approval, and then the question arises that will FDA still review my product? Will they be allowed to review my product if it meets the definition of an LDT? I believe they will, but I'd like to hear some of my colleagues comment on that too. I believe that since the only thing the court ruled on is a test that's developed and validated for use in a single lab, I think if a company has a reasonable basis to differentiate themselves from that, and there might be multiple ways to do that based on a test algorithm, a collection method, various ways, I think the FDA will try to continue, but I'd like to hear what others say about that too.
So, Janice, I agree with you on that point. I think there's also a question of, who would be the plaintiff? Who would actually challenge that if FDA were to give a pre-market clearance or approval to something that feasibly could be characterized as an LDT? How would that decision even be challenged? And so, I think the combination of an unclear pathway to even litigate the issue gives FDA some opportunity to continue to clear LDTs again, with the auspice that they have a viable argument that it, falls outside this idea of a laboratory developed service that's in-house and developed at a single lab and used at a single lab.
Brian, I'd like to hear your thoughts here, but I would like to just pose it in this way. I think, while I agree wholeheartedly with Janice and Blake that these are some of the tensions and issues that are there, I do foresee the possibility that different laboratories will reach different judgments about how they develop their service and where they offer their service and how it's been independently validated within that laboratory. So I don't see it as absolutely black and white that while I do agree there are ways in which laboratories and other stakeholders, including in vitro diagnostics manufacturers, may wish to review this and focus on exactly how their products are defined or their services are defined. I do think that's a tension that is likely to be argued as we continue. This court case is very specific, but also very definitive within that specific. When you start to expand from that, I do think there's going to be these tensions about how these pieces fit together, how they're paid for. But I'd really like your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think one thing, we've seen in recent years is just the complexity of the new technologies has really led to lots of different business models and arrangements among multiple laboratories, academic medical centers, different parts of tests being done at different centers, so bioinformatics and wet work being separated. And so I think now with this decision, we'll continue to see, laboratories continuing to push their technology, which will push their business model. And, possibly for some laboratories, that's going to give them, more flexibility to operate in this space without concern for oversight by the FDA. And in other cases, something may be complex enough that it's involving different parts of different laboratories or algorithms and bioinformatics from different providers, and the FDA pathway may still be something that people want to pursue as part of that approach. And I think a related piece of that is going to be really with the FDA pathway foreclosed for some of these single laboratory tests that clearly meet the definition in the court decision. What will really be the spillover effect at the CLIA level, and will there be sort of a capacity issue that maybe many people feared would happen at the FDA, now happening, at the state level with some of the CLIA programs reviewing these newer and more complex technologies. And the CLIA programs may come up with their own definitions of, what is a single laboratory and, what constitutes a lab for their own purposes. So, as much as we've, closed the chapter in this long-running story, as the science develops and the laboratory industry continues to develop, I think we'll have questions both at the CLIA level and at the FDA level that will continue to develop.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this dialogue with me today and thank everyone for attending. I think this is a perfect example of what the science geek in me would call the three-body problem. You have different things that are circling around each other. The science, the policy, and the law here are all interacting. And that ability to synthesize and help our clients navigate that process and the pendulum swings between where the science says we are and where the law says they have authority and where the policies of various administrations impact that this is the perfect way of pulling each of the various directions. And yet we have yet to see how this is going to be molded. The court case was, again, very definitive in a very specific situation, and how that plays out and continues to mutate and spread and impact our various clients in the space is something we'll have to continue to see. And we're pretty happy to be along for the ride with everyone on this process. So Erkang, Blake, Janice, Eric, Brian, thank you very much for participating today. And we look forward to answering questions that our clients and others may have in this space. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.